Well, first off, hello everybody. Thank you all for coming out this evening. For those of you who haven't met me yet, my name is Chris Modzalewski, and I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Immerseum. And today what I'm here to talk about is basically how museums and sort of the last 150 years of museum theory, exhibit design theory, and practice actually serve as a very useful framework when designing educational VR experiences. Now, a couple of caveats with this. VR is sort of one of those interesting fields where there's a whole lot of different jargon and different technology swirling around. You've got VR, you've got AR, you've got MR, and even within those you have different subcategories like mobile VR, headset VR, web VR, all of these different things. What I'm going to focus on in my discussion today is mainly on what we like to term sort of immersive VR, the 3D modeled VR. Not so much 360 video, because basically the techniques that we're talking about here don't necessarily translate that well to 360 video, which is a whole different medium from a design standpoint. So this is the type of stuff that basically has significant applicability for when you're designing immersive environments, gamified experiences, immersive educational experiences in virtual reality, whether that's mobile virtual reality or whether that's high-end HTC Vive, Oculus Rift type of stuff. Most of what we do is we basically work in Vive, Oculus Rift, and PlayStation VR. So that's sort of where my knowledge base kind of comes from. Many of the techniques that I'm talking about here and sort of the basic principles and ideas do translate to mobile VR as well, but they need to be tweaked for the differences between mobile VR and the higher end VR. So basically, who am I and sort of what am I doing here, right? What we're all about is basically bringing museums closer to consumers. What we're doing is we're basically building an ecosystem for museums and VR developers to rapidly build and distribute their museum content, their museum experiences, in virtual reality. So we're building toolkits to help with that, and a platform that's sort of like iTunes for VR museum experiences. And so in the course of doing that, we've had many conversations with a lot of different museums about basically how museums construct their traditional experiences, their traditional museum exhibits. And this is a huge field of study. Museums have been studying this for the last 150 years, literally. There's so much research about this. As I was putting this presentation together, my wife sort of looked at me and laughed and said, Chris, you're kind of trying to condense 3 different graduate school programs into an hour or an hour and a half long presentation. How's that going to work? Well, we'll see. The important thing about this is that the goal for this presentation, sort of the things that I'd like to share with you guys, is meant to basically be a jumping off point. It's a framework. Because I believe very deeply that there's a lot of overlap between museums and VR and the design techniques that both utilize in order to assist learners. And what that basically means is that we can look to museum studies, we can look to museum practices in order to basically form a framework, a vocabulary, a language for VR design. And this is going to be, to some extent, reductive. By definition, I'm not going to be able to actually go across the 150 years of learning theory, design theory, and museum study research in the course of a 1-hour talk. Literally, many people can get multiple graduate degrees in this subject. So this is really just meant to be a jumping off point, but one that I think can be of immense value as we try to figure out how to design engaging and compelling VR experiences. So let's sort of start from the beginning place. Where do I see the principal overlap between museums and VR? Well, when you think about it, right? When you go to a museum, what are you doing? You open a door. Maybe it's a very ornate door, maybe it is a less ornate door, but you open a door and you step into a new space. You may or may not be familiar with that space, but you have to look around and figure out where you're going to go, what you're going to do, what you're going to look at. That process of orienting yourself in the space and of figuring out where to go from there is fundamentally shared with VR. The difference is that in VR, you put on a headset, and all of a sudden you find yourself in a new space that you might never have been in. Now, that new space in VR may be completely unrealistic, right? It may be wildly different from the real world. But you still face the psychological challenge of orienting yourself in that space. And museums have been working for years to figure out how to best facilitate that orientation process, how to best ground their visitors in a given space. And so I very deeply believe that we can learn from what museums have been doing and sort of take those best practices and sort of apply them to VR. So here's sort of one of the things that I think is incredibly valuable as we think about VR design. In 2001, the Visitor Services Association, which is basically like a working group for various tourism visitor services things, published something called the Visitor's Bill of Rights that basically says these are the things that visitors should be able to get when they visit something. You know, first on their list is comfort, right? People want to feel comfortable when they visit a space. People want orientation. They want it to be easy for them to find their way around. They want to feel welcome in the space where they're present. They want to feel like they are included in that space, that they belong there. They want to have fun, right? You don't want to go someplace and not have fun. You don't want to feel like it's a slog. And they basically want to have social engagement. There's a whole bunch of these sort of values that visitors look for when they visit a given space. And we believe very deeply that these same sort of values, these same kind of principles and aspirations also apply to VR. Basically, on the whole of it, right? If you build a VR experience that meets these expectations, that is comfortable for the user, allows them to orient themselves quickly, lets them socialize, gives them a challenge, revitalizes them, you know what, you're doing fine, right? As sort of goals to work for as we design VR experiences, these are, I think, pretty good kind of lodestones for us to aim at. But how do we do that? Well, when we think about VR design and when we think about museum experiences, we kind of look at 4 components to consider. The first is audience. Who are we talking to, right? Who are we attempting to communicate with? Who are the learners that we want to engage with? Content. What are we actually trying to talk to them about, right? That has an enormous implication on whatever type of either exhibit design we're doing or VR experience design we're doing. Pedagogical approach, because that's what we're here talking about, right? Education, also matters deeply. There are many different ways to design a pedagogical interaction with people, and that has a fundamental impact on how we design either our exhibits or our VR experiences. And then finally, we get to the actual design process itself, where we make 1,001 aesthetic and functional choices and decisions about how we put together what people see and what they can do. Now, within all of this, today, I'm not going to talk about content. Content shapes everything else that we're going to talk about. But basically, if, I don't know, there's maybe 25 of us in this room, if all 25 of us are building VR educational experiences, we're going to have 25 different sets of content, right? That's not what I'm going to be talking about at all today. This is more about looking at the other things, about audience, pedagogical approach, and design, and sort of what are potentially some starting points for how to think about these things. So let's dive into audience, right? Who is the audience? This is a question that we always ask ourselves very early on in any type of a project. Who are we talking to? And there's various different ways to talk about an audience. In VR education, we sort of divide the audience into 2 categories. There's what we call the free audience, which is basically people who are coming to experience the VR experience because they want to, right? It's a leisure activity for them. They want to have fun. They fire up the VR app because they're basically hoping to have a good time, maybe learn something in the process, right? And then there's the captive audience, which the captive audience applies much more in a management training type of situation. They're there because their bosses ask them to go. And so this is the type of thing that certain VR education apps sort of are more oriented on this audience. Bless you. Now, those different types of audiences constrain the type of motivations that drive people to have an educational experience. This is basically a set of identity-related motivations that were researched by two giants in the museum studies field, John Falk and Lynn Dierking. Basically, these are different ways that people are motivated to visit museums. Now, this isn't the type of thing where I would be an explorer and always an explorer, right? I would always be driven by curiosity to visit a given museum. These are situational, they're variable, and they're fluid between each other. I might be an explorer when I visit the American Natural History Museum, but I might well be a respectful pilgrim when I visit the 9/11 Memorial. Basically, these audience motivations are integral as we think about how to design our VR experience for shaping how that experience is constructed. What is the atmosphere of the experience, the tone of the experience? What is the interaction of the experience? If my audience is primarily coming to my experience as explorers, for example, that may mean that they're looking for a different type of interaction than experience seekers. Experience seekers may be looking to do something that is more exciting, more bigger, louder, right? They may walk away dissatisfied if the experience is quieter. Explorers, they might look for other things. Facilitators who are specifically looking for social enablement, who are looking to basically the social dimension of exhibition and exhibit interaction. Well, if a VR experience doesn't have a social component, they might well be disappointed. So these are sort of the things that can guide people, that motivate them to step into an educational experience. And these different type of things should be considered when we think about how to design our VR experiences to best meet those needs. No single VR experience is going to satisfy all of these different groups 100% of the way. And that's fine, right? That's not a problem. But it's the type of thing that as we think about how we design those experiences, it's something we want to bear in mind and consider, right? Now, within this, right, even with all of these different types of people who are motivated to come to these exhibits, you then get different types of audience behavior when they actually show up. This is a taxonomy of audience behavior that I think a guy by the name of Philip Hughes put together, which basically describes how do people approach navigating a museum. And what we've basically found is that in VR educational experiences, these hold true pretty well as well. The first type of person is the expert, right? They basically know the terrain. They know where everything is. They're looking for something specific. They're looking to supplement something, to take a deeper dive into something. That changes the way that they navigate the space, both in a physical museum, and it changes the way that they approach the VR experience as well, because they're looking to immediately dive into something rather than be passively engaged with something, right? They're very self-directed in terms of their behavior. You have the frequent traveler, who is in some cases similar to the expert, but basically they are more interested in exploring and discovering things that are new to them. They already know largely where things are, they know the basic shape, they've been to the museum before, but they want to see what has changed, what is new, and possibly dive deeper into that. They may be less self-directed than the expert, right? They may be self-directed to a point, where that point is, okay, I've now found something new, now I'm willing to step back and enjoy the ride to learn what I can find. You have the scout, who basically doesn't know the terrain, but they want to figure out sort of the big picture. They want to find the main landmarks. What are the flagship exhibits in this museum? Or what are the flagship sort of key points in this VR experience? And finally, you've got the orienteer, who the orienteer basically doesn't know what they're doing, where they're going. They're there, and in some cases you may think of them as being kind of lost and at the will of the designer to be guided to an experience that is going to satisfy them. Now, all of this kind of translates into what the engagement process is. Now, in museums, you've basically got 4 stages of engagement. The first one is orientation, which typically, statistically, lasts anywhere from 3 to 10 minutes. This is what happens when you first step into a museum, right? You're looking around, trying to figure out what's there, where to go, where should I go, things like that. Once you've oriented yourself, then there's the intensive looking phase, where this is that part of when we go to a museum and we're really good students, right? We read every single label from start to finish. We look at every single exhibit systematically, diligently, right? This is the part where we're concentrating. And that usually lasts, depending on the person, depending on the museum, 15 to up to 40 minutes. Some people are really conscientious students and can go longer, but generally this is a limited time frame. And then people start getting fatigued. Either mentally fatigued, physically fatigued, whatever it is, they move on to cruising, which is when they stop paying attention systematically to everything that they see, but instead look for things that grab their attention. And once their attention is grabbed, then they invest effort and energy and focus on what has grabbed their attention, but it's not universal, right? It's not everything. It's just those things that stand out to them. And then finally, usually a couple of hours into the process, somebody needs to use the bathroom, they're hungry, they leave, right? What we have found in our user testing is that VR educational experiences are very similar to this pattern as well. One of the main differences, however, is that the time periods are compressed. So in VR, what we've found is that the orientation period is lightning fast. Basically, we found typically you've got about 3 minutes to orient the user in your VR experience. If they're not oriented within the first couple of minutes, they're going to be very dissatisfied with the experience. And this orientation satisfaction is actually key, because one of the things that museum studies have found time and time again is that the strongest predictor of overall satisfaction with a given museum visit and the greatest predictor of information retention from a museum exhibit is the speed and satisfaction with the orientation phase of this process. Orientation in museums is absolutely critical. And we've basically found this very consistent results when looking at VR experiences. You want people who enter into your VR experiences to understand where they are, what they're doing, and what they can do, and how to do it. And the sooner they gain that understanding, the more comfortable they are with that understanding, the better experience they're going to have, and the more satisfying they're going to be.
Chris,
yep.
Have you got examples or thoughts about when people don't get that right?
Yeah.
Like when someone's into a thing, and what's one that you think that people might have, like a common one you might have?
So here's an example, right? And this is actually an example from not an educational experience, but a game, where overall they actually do a lot of things right within this game. And point of fact, later on, I've got a screenshot from the game showing some of the things that they do right. But within part of their UI, in part of the menu system, the scaffolding that they have for configuring the user behavior and configuring the avatar, they break the consistency of their interaction mechanic. So this is a game called Dead and Buried. It's a game for the Oculus Rift. I don't recall whether it's available for HTC Vive. But basically it's a Western gunslinger game, right? And within this game, they've got a very clean menu system. It's consistent, it's easy to understand, you have your virtual gun, and you shoot the menu items to pick where you're going to go. Until you get to the point of choosing your in-game avatar, what you look like. Where, again, you've got your gun, you've progressed through the menu system in a certain way, and you would think that picking your avatar is going to similarly rely on shooting the thing you want to select. You've got your cards of avatars in front of you, and you would think that you would point your gun and you would shoot. No. You have to tap it to activate it. You don't point your gun at it and pull the trigger. You have to actually touch the card. This is something that we found when examining user behavior in this halts people, brings their orientation in the experience to a grinding halt, because what they have been taught by the game as to how to interact with it suddenly no longer applies. And so that's an example of where something like that goes wrong in what is otherwise actually a very well-designed UI system. I have lots of praise for their scaffolding, and I'll talk about that in a second. But that's an example of where that type of orientation really can fail, right? So once a person's oriented within a VR educational experience, the relationship between cruising and intensive looking is very different than in a museum. And the reason for that is basically because not all educational experiences in VR sort of have the self-directed, free-flowing options of a museum, right? A museum, you can choose to go to Gallery A, Gallery B, Gallery C. You've got lots of choices, right? Within each gallery, you can look at different exhibits. Most VR educational experiences are a little bit more constrained. There tend to be fewer choices. But basically, you still have a very similar dynamic of intensive looking, which is basically investing in a particular experience within the VR application. And if the VR application offers multiple experiences, you might have a cruising period as well. And depending upon the context of the VR application, and depending upon sort of the content and how it's structured, users can switch between these two modes fairly regularly or pretty frequently. One of the things that we've seen is that in certain VR experiences, particularly ones that have a strong single user, single player component, that'll occupy sort of the intensive looking period, right? Then, at a certain point, people will grow fatigued, they'll be done playing the single player mode of the game. And they'll switch into the multiplayer mode, just for a couple minutes, just to see what it's like. They'll dip their toes in the water to experiment with it. And that's sort of the analog to the cruising component to this. The cruising component tends to be very short. So within an actual museum, cruising tends to run up to 45 minutes to an hour sometimes. In VR, cruising tends to be shortened, very much so, because it seems to be driven to a large extent by the degree of fatigue that a user already has. And then leave taking is extremely shortened because people just exit, right? You know, in a museum, it takes a while to actually get out of the museum. You got to go through the museum shop, you've got to stop off in the restaurant, the kids need to go to the bathroom. It's a process. In a VR experience, you just quit. So that's very, very fast. So that's sort of the audience, right? These are sort of the audience type of things that we want to think about as we approach our VR experience. What about pedagogy, right? We're talking about education here. We want to be educating people. It's not just, playing games, right? However important gamification may be. When we talk about pedagogical approach, what we basically mean is, what is the answer to the question? How does your experience impart knowledge to your visitor? That's the pedagogical approach, right? There's not one answer to that question. No experience, not even in school, not even, if you're watching a documentary, no experience is entirely one type of pedagogical approach. But basically, how your experience imparts knowledge to your visitor is fundamental to the design of that experience. Because basically, if you want to switch into kind of user experience terms, that's your interaction model. That's how the user of your application interacts with it. And that shapes most of your downstream design choices. So how are those approaches balanced, right? In the museum world, there's broadly 4 different learning models or pedagogical models that are applied. The first is didactic, right? We all know this model. This is the typical, teacher-school model. It's where the visitor, the learner, is relatively passive in the process. They may read something, they may listen to something, they may watch something, but they're not necessarily actually doing stuff. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing, right? We all learn this way to some extent. Some people learn better this way, other people learn worse this way. But this is a tool of pedagogy that all museum experiences apply, to some extent, greater or lesser extent. A little bit further down the spectrum, you've got the experiential model, where this is basically the active learning model. This is the one where learners are encouraged to actually apply knowledge, to play with stuff, to do stuff, to interact with the environment around them, and draw conclusions from that and apply that. This is basically where, traditionally, museums have focused, especially in the last 30 years, a lot of their attention. Because basically, this is theoretically what a museum gives you that, reading a textbook doesn't, right? And in VR, this is also part of the key value that VR as an educational tool can provide. If I'm learning how to configure the control panel on a space shuttle in a VR experience, I can read the instruction manual, right? But in VR, I can actually experiment with it. I can have a simulation of it. And it's that experiential component that helps to cement the learning and cement the knowledge on the part of the learner. Sort of continuing along the spectrum, you then get what's called the discovery model, which I kind of like to joke around that the discovery model is basically the experiential model on steroids, right? This is the model where the experiential, where basically the learner is largely left to figure it out on their own. The theory behind this is basically that one of the most powerful learning experiences, one of the most best retained learning experiences, is one in which the learner has an aha moment. Archimedes in the bathtub going eureka, right? Where they've suddenly been able to combine all of the different things that they've heard and experienced themselves and figured out how it applies. In museums, this is incredibly influential on especially children's museums. The whole sort of children's museum movement is largely built around sort of this learning model. And in practice, the way it often works is that a problem is presented to the learner, and then they're let loose with a bunch of different tools, a bunch of different things that they can do and interact with in order to potentially solve the problem. They're not necessarily told how to solve the problem or even given hints as to how to solve the problem, but they're given a set of tools and opportunities to figure it out for themselves. And then finally, we get to constructivism. Now, this one is a little bit grayed out, right? Because constructivism is basically this kind of idealistic theory of learning that dates back to the late 19th century, I believe, that basically has been enormously influential on museum studies and, quite frankly, education in general. What this theory basically says is people build knowledge. They assemble knowledge from their life experiences, from everything that they hear and everything that they see. And in theory, a constructivist learning experience is one like the discovery model, also on steroids, right? Where basically you give people very little direction and you let them build their own mental model and information from that. Now, the reason why it's grayed out is because it's an ideal sort of, it's the Platonic ideal of learning in some sense. It's not very practical, right? Because you're not going to put a bunch of students or a bunch of learners in a situation and give them zero direction whatsoever. It just doesn't work in practice, right? It's a theoretical ideal, a philosophical ideal that in practice usually sort of breaks down into more of the discovery and experiential models that are heavily sort of shaped by constructivist theory. Now again, all of these different models, what they basically do is they shape how you construct your experience. It is rare to find a museum exhibit that is only one of these models. They usually involve some blend of them, maybe weighted more to the didactic side, maybe weighted more to the experiential side, but basically there's a blend of these models that gets applied because different people learn in different ways. and because, quite frankly, it makes it more interesting. So the didactic approach in museums is usually reflected in labels next to things, right? You walk up, you read the label, maybe you remember something from that label, maybe not. Audio guides, guided tours where you have a docent or a curator taking you around the museum and showing you stuff, reference catalogs and research and interactive displays. These are sort of things where the learner is basically receiving the communication. The communication is unidirectional for the most part. In VR, most of these same sort of devices can also apply. You can have labels and text. You can have audio guides. You can have character guides with virtual characters who sort of play the role of a tour guide or an instructor. Reference catalogs and guided tours, all of this is possible within VR as well. So the same sort of didactic vocabulary, the same didactic toolkit can apply within VR. From a more experiential standpoint, here you've got a variety of different things, right? You've got animatronics and dioramas. You've got manipulatable objects, like I can pick up this tomahawk, for example, or I can, move around with, or I can pick up a frog if I'm in a life sciences type thing. You've got immersive environments that simulate a given situation. You also have social interaction. This is one of those things that a lot of museums these days put a tremendous focus on, and that's on encouraging their visitors, especially children, to turn the experience of visiting a museum into a social interaction, so that they're co-learning about whatever subject it is that they're looking at. Because what studies have shown is that helps embed the knowledge. It helps them internalize the knowledge of the experience. And gamification. Hands-on tasks, interactive displays, stuff like that. Similar things also are present within VR. So in a VR environment, well, by definition, a VR environment is a simulated environment, right? From the standpoint of a VR experience, right, or a museum experience, if I want to put someone into the emptiness of space, right, in a museum, I can only get so far in terms of doing that, right? I can paint the walls black, I can put little dots on the ceiling and on the walls, and I can sort of approximate it, right? Well, within VR, I can approximate weightlessness. I can fool the brain into thinking that the person is weightless. By definition, as a simulated environment, it gives us the opportunity to make that simulation feel much more real in a way that is cost-effective. Because if I were going to simulate weightlessness in an actual physical space, that's going to get very pricey. The discovery standpoint, you've again got similar set of tools, right? One of the main differences between the resources from a design standpoint that are used in a discovery approach don't actually relate to the tools of the exhibit, right? I can have a discovery experience that uses the exact same objects as an experiential one would. The difference is in the narrative. The difference is in how it's presented, in the structure of the communication, and the structure of the experience that the learner goes through in the process. And basically, that structure is basically content, right? That's, in my experience, the principal difference between the discovery approach and the experiential approach in terms of what you do with it. So from a VR design standpoint, what this means is that the decision between experiential and discovery modes really boils down to a decision of how are we structuring the narrative of our communication? How do we shape the experience that the user has as they progress through this process? Now, other things to consider in terms of pedagogy are learning styles. Now, learning styles are something that from a learning theory standpoint come in and out of vogue about every other month. There are two taxonomies of learning styles that I have found to be helpful as I think about structuring educational experiences in VR. One is from Honey and Mumford, who basically did learning styles in a particular management training context, where basically they talk about theorists, reflectors, pragmatists, and activists, which basically are different ways that people interact with and learn, sort of how they approach the development of knowledge. A second taxonomy of learning styles that is incredibly useful is actually from the world of museums. And it's from Bernice McCarthy, who, if I recall correctly, was at the V&A, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London for many years. And she divides them into analytical learners, imaginative learners, common sense learners, and experimental learners. And this reflects how people build their knowledge, particularly within a museum context. And what I find is that this taxonomy, Bernice McCarthy's taxonomy, is a very good way of thinking about how are we letting people in our VR experiences learn? Are we giving experimenters the opportunity to experiment? Are we giving analytical learners the more didactic orientation that they might be looking for? So, learning styles can be controversial, but they are yet another way of thinking about these things. So, okay, that's it for sort of the big picture kind of theory stuff, right? Design. How do we bring all of this together? We sort of divide the practice of design in VR into kind of 8 components. You've got the environment, you've got path, scaffolding, signposting, interaction, passive content, lighting, and social. We're not going to talk about either lighting or social today for 2 different reasons. One, lighting, because basically it's a technical, complicated process that involves talking about shaders and stuff like that, and I'm totally not qualified to discuss that. And social, because we actually don't have enough experience in that to be able to talk about it. The social component is one that in museum studies has been shown time and again to be huge. We've only barely started experimenting with multi-user VR educational experiences. We don't have enough data to be able to kind of draw sweeping generalizations or conclusions about it, right? It's something that I'm absolutely certain is going to be integral over time. It's going to be fundamental to the process of building VR educational experiences in one capacity or another. But right now, I just don't have much to say about it because it's very early days yet for us. So let's sort of start with the first kind of set of these things: environment, path, scaffolding, and signposting. These are sort of a set of issues that have the greatest impact on orientation. These are the design choices that we make that determine how quickly, how easily, how smoothly our audience is oriented in our VR environment, how comfortable they are within the VR environment. Do they know what to do and where to go? And so they all interrelate very closely. Let's start with environment. When we talk about environment, we're basically talking about the space the visitor is in. Now, the cool thing about VR is, as I said before, the space can be pretty much anything you can simulate, right? It can be an exterior space, it can be an interior room, and what the environment basically does for you is it fundamentally shapes 2 things in the visitor's mind. One is atmosphere, the emotional tone, the frame of mind that your learner has when they first enter into your VR exhibit. Are they scared? Are they comfortable? Do they feel welcome? Does it amp up their anxiety levels? Are they standing at the top of a cliff and therefore suddenly find their heart palpitating? This shapes the experience. It sets the tone for your learner's experience in a fundamental way. A very good example of this that I find really interesting from a psychological standpoint is the VR app Fearless VR, which is the bottom screenshot here. Now, Fearless VR is a therapeutic app. It's designed to help people deal with phobias. In this case, a phobia, arachnophobia, fear of spiders. This is a screenshot from the first level of Fearless VR, right? It's an interior room. You got a cute little cartoon spider on a TV screen, right? Now, atmosphere and tone and emotional grounding is integral to a therapeutic process that deals with phobias, right? Like, it should be at any rate. And what the designers for Fearless VR did with this is really clever, because they built into their experience graduated stages of tension and anxiety, starting with something that, now I'm not an arachnophobic, but isn't probably that scary, right? The cute little cartoon spider. But as you progress through the experience, the tension and the atmosphere amps up. The realism of the spiders increases. And so that management of atmosphere and tension and the emotions of the visitor is an integral part of the process. Now that's in a therapeutic app, and one can have semantic discussions whether therapy and education sort of align, but it's still a useful technique to bear in mind. The second thing that environment does is it shapes orientation. It's often tempting to think about environment as being the backdrop, right? We design our VR scene. Here we've got our backdrop where the scene takes place. But the environment can do much more than that, because how you design that environment shapes how people orient themselves in that environment. It shapes what they think they can do, what they want to do, where they naturally go. And so it's the type of thing that as we design VR environments, we want to bear that in mind, right? You can make the environment work for you in the process of doing so. And one of the techniques for doing that is a technique called signposting, which I'll get to in a brief second. The most important thing about environment is that basically the first thing people do when they enter into a museum or when they enter into VR is they look around. That's the first thing that they do. And so the environment shapes everything else. It's the starting point for everything that people do within the experience. Then we get to path. Now, path is complicated. Path is probably, in our opinion, the single most important concept in experience design. It's kind of this all-encompassing kind of macro concept, because what it basically boils down to is the answer to the question, what can the visitor do? What are their choices within the environment? In museum studies, it's called exhibit strategy, right? And it shapes how the museum is laid out. It shapes how exhibits are designed. But in VR, it basically is something that affects all of the interaction design, all of the environment design, and basically everything, right? It's the question of what can people do? And it is a question that, as designers, we ask ourselves at multiple levels of the experience. When designing a VR experience, it's kind of like this Russian Matryoshka doll, right? You've got your overall application, where you may have certain choices you can make. Then you've got your scene, where you have other choices you can make. Within that scene, if somebody has made a specific choice, you drill down and you can do still something else. And then with a particular object, you can do different things with that object. You may use it as intended, or you may throw it at, your friend who is in the VR experience with you, right? The choices around path are choices that you're going to be making time and time again at different levels of your VR experience, at sort of different points in the process. So it is really important. The first key decision we sort of like to focus on is basically, does a person have in the experience a single path to follow or multiple paths to follow? This decision shapes so much of the design that follows. Because basically, if you have to give people multiple options, well, you need to have some way of actually, giving them those options, right? This is a fundamental choice. If somebody has a single option, that's a little bit easier, right? There are fewer moving parts to consider. But you still have to make choices around control. For example, if they've got a single path to follow, are they in control of when they progress from one moment in the sequence to the next? Or is control taken away from them? Do you, as the designer, enforce your own control as the director of the experience? Now, the second key decision is one that especially comes into play with multiple options. And that's, how do people choose their path? Now, we sort of think of it as being three different options for path selection: realized path selection, abstract, and hybrid. What are these things? Well, here's a screenshot from the lab, a experience produced by Valve for the HTC Vive. This is an example of realized path selection. In the lab, you basically find yourself in a laboratory. There isn't a UI menu of choices or things like that for you to pick from and say, I want to play the slingshot game. Instead, what you have is you have physically modeled stations in the laboratory, realized stations, that in order to choose a path, in order to enter into the slingshot game, you have to go to the physically modeled station and interact with it. It makes the selection of the path integrated into the environment. It's part and parcel of the environment. It's not distinct in any way. If you want to enter the slingshot game or any of the other games, you have to go to the station and interact with the teleportation orb. Now, an abstract path selection is different. It's not tied into the environment itself. Instead, it's much more part of the user interface, the menu system. This is a screenshot from Oculus Home, where in the Oculus Home experience, you're basically placed into this, living room, parlor, whatever you want to call it, right? There's a fire crackling, there are couches and stuff like that, but you can't actually do anything with the environment. The only thing you can do is you can look around, or you can interact with this abstract floating menu in order to select from that menu the things that you're looking for. I want to play this game, or I want to play that game, or experience this VR application. This is an abstract path selection model because it's not tied into the environment. It's not something that is made to feel integrated into the reality that you're simulating. Then there's a hybrid model. Now, this is a screenshot from an early prototype of our Immerseum application, where what we're doing there is we're following, to some extent, a realized model where we have different stations. But when you interact with a particular station, it pulls up an abstract model. It pulls up a UI menu for museum experiences in a particular category, maybe history, maybe biology, whatever the category might be. And basically what this does is it allows us to sort of split the difference between the benefits of the realized model and the abstract model. Because basically each of these models is good at certain particular things. The realized approach is optimized for immersion. You're putting the user in this simulated space. They're grounded in that space, and their entire interaction is with that space as they perceive it. But the problem with that approach, the challenge, is the interaction mechanic. I've demoed the lab for people numerous times, and whenever I do, there's usually a fairly sizable number of people who can't figure out how to interact with the teleportation orb. Because that's not natural, right? We as people don't actually have, sadly, teleportation orbs, right? And so how to interact with that mechanic is part of the challenge from an orientation standpoint. The second issue with a realized approach is that it works very well with a limited number of paths. Now, one of the interesting things that we've actually found is that if the options available in a realized model hit about 8, that's the point at which confusion starts setting in. People will have difficulty figuring out where to go, what to do, and how to work with this. What's interesting is that this is actually entirely consistent with museum experiences as well. When in a museum experience you have 8 exhibits laid out in a particular gallery, people start getting confused. Their satisfaction drops. Their speed of orientation decreases. It's an interesting sort of cognitive point. Now, what we found is that in VR...
Retail too.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, one of the interesting things that we've actually found in VR is we actually recommend going a little bit more conservatively than that with a realized model. Now, We don't know why that is. It may be because VR has a more narrow field of view than our actual natural eyes, but we generally tend to find that realized models with 4 to 5 options work better than realized models with 6 or 7. 6 or 7 is still doable and okay. We haven't seen bad results with that, but we see significantly better results with 4 to 5. Now, the abstract path selection model optimizes efficiency. It doesn't optimize immersion, right? Because you've got this abstract menu thing, right? It's not part of the real world, even your simulated real world. But what it does do is it helps you relatively quickly navigate through many different choices, like the, however many tens or hundreds of VR experiences you have in Oculus Home or in Steam VR. And it also gives you the opportunity to do different design elements to help users navigate those choices. Things like introducing filtering options, adding in search, and other things like that that are difficult to do in a realized environment. Now, those options have their own set of challenges, right? If you want to build search into your VR experience, you've got to have some way of letting people actually enter in their search terms, right? That is a big challenge in and of itself. But the abstract model provides a relatively comfortable way for a user to understand how to navigate that. People understand what a search box is in an abstract menu system. I don't even know what a search box in a realized environment would look like because, sadly, I don't have a search box right here. The hybrid path selection, we find, works well to sort of blend the two. We utilize the realized model in order to enhance immersion, help comfort, help orientation. But we still have the challenge of having many choices. So the realized version, the realized model is something that we use as the first level of filtering because it helps people orient themselves, give themselves a feeling of control and immersion before bringing up the abstract menu, the abstract UI that they can then use to look for the experience that they actually want to have. So it's a useful tool to do two things. One is to familiarize people with your interaction mechanic, to introduce the way that visitors interact with your virtual world. What does the trigger on the controller do? And the second thing that it helps to do is to introduce in a expected fashion the scaffolding, the UI menu. Because different UI choices, each design, you should first off always be using a consistent one within your experience, but the user has to learn how to navigate that. They have to be taught through the application what is the way in which they interact with that scaffolding. And the hybrid path, we found, sort of helps to do that, smooths that process. Now, in practice, right, so I've talked a lot about sort of the introductory path, right? Those choices of realized, abstract, and hybrid are particularly relevant at the very beginning of your experience. But they're also relevant later on. And in practice, a full VR experience is going to have a blend of different path choices at different points in your experience. For example, most video games, most games start off with a menu system, right? They have an abstract path selection process at the very beginning. But once you enter into the game, they tend to veer towards a more realized selection. I want to go there and do that, or I want to go over there and fight those people. A blend of path selection choices is in practice something that you're going to be seeing a lot of. But it's something to consider and to shape those path selection options in a way that is organic and internally consistent within your experience. Now, this is just one sort of little tidbit of information that I found particularly interesting from museum studies. Path selection processes are culturally dependent. For example, most people who come from cultures where text is read from left to right, or people who drive on the right-hand side of the street the way we do, when they enter a museum gallery, their first instinct is to turn right. That's the first thing that they do. People who come from cultures who read right to left, or also the Brits who drive on the left-hand side of the street, their first instinct is to turn left. We have found exactly the same behavior in VR environments. The direction that people turn initially is entirely consistent with those results. Just simply something to be aware of. So, okay. Now, path selection shapes how you lay things out in your VR scene as well. Let's say, hypothetically, I'm designing a VR experience where I've got a simulated Aboriginal hut. I've got tables with different artifacts, I've got a fire somewhere, and I've got different objects that people can interact with, simulated, realized within my scene. How I lay those things out in my scene, the relationship of their positions to my visitor, is also something that matters, right? It shapes how the visitor explores the scene, how they interact with the content, how they interact with the information that you're presenting to them. So there's a variety of different patterns for this. There's, quite frankly, so many patterns that I can't possibly go through all of them. But there are several that are very common because they do certain things very, very well. Now, the linear pattern is the easiest one, right? You've got a straightforward sequential experience. The visitor doesn't have any choices. They've got to go through experience A, then experience B, then experience C. A very good example of this is the app Immerseum, where if you go into their Stonehenge experience, you're basically on rails, right? You can't do much. You're locked into listening to the audio guide talk about Stonehenge and progress over time to different views of how Stonehenge changed over the centuries. Linear experience. The visitor doesn't choose anything. They're locked into the process. Now, within this linear path, the critical choice that as designers we need to make is, do we give the visitor control or not? Do we give them the opportunity to replay experiences or not? Do we give them the opportunity to skip experiences or to choose where in the sequence they go? Now, that's a design choice that we need to make. This linear path is sort of the classic didactic model. I, as the designer, am the teacher, and this is the way you're going to experience this content. That's not a bad thing. It's just simply one pattern to choose from. Then you've got what's called the themed pattern, or the multiple path option. And this is sort of the diametric opposite of the linear path. This is where you've got a whole bunch of things that may be grouped into different themes, grouped into different areas. And the visitor can largely choose what sequence they interact with things in to sort of build this organic understanding of the subject matter. The visitor can move through these different experiences as they choose, or we can also constrain them in some way. For example, some museums, when they organize their exhibits in this themed pattern, what they'll do is they'll have organized tours or organized audio guides that follow a particular theme. So you have this themed exhibit with different cultures and different time periods, and so here you get a guided tour that picks one of those themes and follows it, that constrains the visitor's choices. This is something which works very well in environments where you want to satisfy both users who want to explore things, so somebody who wants to explore, they can pick where they want to go, or in situations where you want to provide a more structured experience. Because basically the environment is the same in both cases. What you do is you shape the interaction that the user has with your experience. So explorers, they can go wherever they want. They can move around the scene, interact with whatever they want to experience. A more analytical learner, somebody who is more interested in a didactic or constrained experience, you can lock them into a rail that follows a particular path or a particular sequence of these exhibits. A radial pattern is also something that's interesting. Now, historically, it's actually really interesting because it was about 100 years or so between when it was first conceptualized and when it was actually implemented. A radial pattern is basically you've got a bunch of concentric rings with different themes in each ring, and the visitor moves through each ring and moves through the themes and sort of builds their understanding as they progress. It's an interesting pattern, one that is impractical for many museums because it's one that takes up a lot of space, right? It requires a pretty big physical space to do it. But in VR, it's something that may be very, very interesting to work with. It's just sort of a way of organizing the information that sort of combines choice in terms of which ring of the concentric rings the user is in, which theme the user is working with, but still locks them in to some extent into a sequence, because the progression around the ring shapes the sequence. Then you've got a star pattern. Now, the star pattern is incredibly useful when you've got a main feature, when you've got your principal thing that you want to highlight. And then you've got supplemental stuff, right? You've got things that aren't necessarily as important as the primary element that you want to deal with, but that add context, add information, add value to the experience. So basically what you do is you put the big main thing right in the middle and you put the supplemental things around it. And this allows people to naturally first go to the primary thing, and then to supplement that primary experience with whatever they find from the supplemental materials around it. Very, very useful, very, very commonly found. It's in many respects, this is actually sort of the pattern that if you've ever played Job Simulator, that Job Simulator often utilizes in their environment design. Now, areas of affinity is another design pattern. It's an interesting one. It's one that is most commonly found in art museums, where basically you've got a bunch of different paintings or exhibits that are somehow related to each other, that are organized and presented in a shared space. And next to that, you've got another sort of shared area of affinity with a bunch of other paintings and art. It's an interesting model in that context. I don't believe that it is very practical for experiential designs. For more passive viewing of things, it works very well because it relies upon people seeing the affinity between different experiences. But it's one thing to see the shared traits of a bunch of paintings that are around you in a given area of affinity, and it's something else entirely to experience something, to focus in on it, and get that sense of connection. This is something that we think doesn't work for experiential pedagogical approaches or discovery approaches. It is something that can work very well for didactic modeling. Then you've got the fan pattern, which is really pretty straightforward, right? You've got the user, they're looking at something, they got a bunch of choices to pick from. The main benefit of this pattern as a path selection option is it's fast. It is the fastest orientation option available to people. We instinctively understand when we look at a bunch of things, we can go there, we can go there, we can go there. It is the fastest option you've got. And it's one of the things that we find works very, very well as the initial jumping off point. When designing an experience, this is a very good way to rapidly orient the visitor in the options that they've got to choose from. And finally, you've got the map pattern, where the map pattern is interesting in that there's a single hub that directs the visitor to other sort of themes or categories of experience. Now, in VR, it's an interesting potential model. We haven't done a lot of experimentation with it, but we believe that this is a model that can work relatively well as a hybrid path selection tool, where basically you've got your hybrid realization of a path selection. The map is sort of this abstract menu that you pick from that then takes you into that particular experience. Now, the important thing about path selection is that they can and should be applied at sort of every level of your design. At the macro level, they shape how the user moves through your application. And at the micro level, it shapes how people interact with the objects in your scene. What do they pick up? What do they throw? What direction do they throw it in? And that is very, very key. That sort of at each of these stages, path selection shapes what the user does and where they focus. Now, one of the helpful things within this is something that we call scaffolding, which is the UI portion of it. This is the stuff that is abstract, right? It's not integrated seamlessly into the environment. Now, one of the best examples of this that I can think of is from that game that I had mentioned earlier, Dead and Buried, this is a screenshot of it here. Now, that game, as I said, screwed up in their scaffolding at one particular point. But within their scaffolding, they build this hybrid scaffolding model that allows the user to sort of see the different options that they've got there. You can do the quick draw experience, the shootout experience, the horde experience, and then you've got your menu of choices with different settings. And the interaction mechanic with these things is extremely simple. You point your virtual gun and you shoot the thing that you want to do. Very simple, very clean, very organic. Simple fan pattern and implementation, with the scaffolding for a more abstract UI with the little signs over on the right-hand side. Now, the key thing about sort of scaffolding is basically that it allows the user to do several things. One, lets them pick a path, lets them back up their choices, meaning, I've chosen to go down this path, but now I've changed my mind. I want to back out of that choice. And it lets them leave the experience, lets them exit. These are things that are vitally important for the user to feel a sense of control. The user needs to feel that sense of control because otherwise they're going to be uncomfortable. Also in practice, scaffolding is pretty much the only way I've ever seen for configuration settings to be done, because configuration settings tends to be a little bit hard to actually realize in the virtual world in those cases. Now we come to signposting. Signposting is part of the design of an experience that is integral to orientation. My favorite example of signposting is this screenshot right here from the movie Beetlejuice, where when they get to Beetlejuice's little grave, there's the big giant neon sign with flashing lights saying Beetlejuice, Beetlejuice, right there, That's an example of signposting, right? It's a realized visual indicator of something, right? Something that should draw the viewer's attention, that the viewer should focus on. Something that is realized within the environment. And in general, signposts assist with three different types of orientation. There's topographical orientation, where am I? There's conceptual orientation, what am I dealing with? What is the subject of this thing I'm doing? And mechanical orientation, what do I do or how do I do it? Signposting in a VR experience and in a museum helps with all three of these things. So topographical signposting can either be explicit, right? Like in the case of the Beetlejuice sign. It doesn't get much more explicit than an arrow with flashing neon lights, right? That's a signpost that says this is something you need to do. Or it can also be implicit. It can subtly guide and shape the user's focus. So here in this case, in our earlier prototype, you see that the different stations are on these little tiny elevated pedestals. That's something that doesn't call attention to itself, really. But what it does is, it does two things. One, it unifies the elements of each station into a single unit, and it differentiates each of the stations from each other, which subtly shape the user's expectation that they know that each of those pedestals is one thing that they can interact with. And so they can implicitly signpost things and communicate things to the user. The lab does something similarly with the yellow box around their stations as well. Just a simple example. In an actual museum, you can see guided pathways in the floor sometimes in some museums and things like that. It doesn't have to be super explicit and glaring, such as, a big sign that says, go here. Now, implicit signposting, there's a variety of tools that you can use to do that. One is object size, right? Very simple. You want to draw attention to something, make it a very distinctly different size than the things around it. You got object isolation, put it on its own. Object color or object position. These are the things that you can choose to subtly guide where your visitors look, what they fixate on. You've got texture or its environment. What is its lighting? How is it lit? This is something that also ties in very closely with interaction mechanics. One of the things that works very well for interaction mechanics and the mechanical signposting is to highlight interactive objects. The things that the user can interact with in a VR experience, make them glow. Makes them stand out. Makes the user understand that this is something that is special, that deserves attention and deserves focus. Now, conceptual signposting is something that, in practice, grows naturally out of your content, right? So here, each of these stations corresponds to a particular category of museum experience, right? The pyramids and canon relate to historical museums, right? There's a theme there that is shared. Conceptual signposting is really something that grows out of your content. And if you're designing your content so that it is structured in a cohesive narrative, it'll take care of itself, basically. Now, mechanical signposting in VR is particularly important because the mechanic for interacting with a VR world is not necessarily natural, right? I don't actually have wands in my hand, or I don't have a little touch controller with buttons when I interact with the real world around me. So how I interact with the virtual world is something that, as a VR user, I need to be shown. What can I interact with, and how do I interact with that? And there's largely two methods of doing this in VR. One is, as I mentioned before, a visual indicator of what is interactive. This is a screenshot from Job Simulator, where it's a little hard to see on the screen, but basically these little things down here have a blue glow around them. They're what you're supposed to pick up in order to interact with different things. That's a simple visual indication that these things are interactive. A second thing is an abstract tutorial that demonstrates how to do something. What is the mechanic of interacting? Job Simulator does that as well, where here JobBot, my character guide who guides me through the Job Simulator experience, is actually showing a picture of my Oculus Touch controller and saying, push this button to go back. Right? Now that's abstract, right? The Oculus Touch controller doesn't exist within the VR world. But you've got that abstract tutorial that demonstrates how to do something. Now within this mechanical signposting, those type of tutorials are very useful, particularly when your experience has a variety of different types of interactions. One of the best designed that I've seen is actually for a relatively new game called Siren, which basically, when you first play the game, you start off by essentially being in this sort of little room and laboratory, and it guides you through, step by step, how to do different things, how to pick things up, how to move around the space, how do you deal with locomotion. And it step by step guides you through it and provides a tutorial before you actually start the experience. Now, at the moment, those kind of things are necessary. And the reason for that is because VR is so new, we haven't really developed a vocabulary, a best practices, a universal set of interaction mechanics that everybody's used to. 5 years from now, we probably will have that, right? There'll be standards that people are used to. But today, everybody's developing those standards as we speak. And basically, interaction within all of this is pretty much key, right? Because you've got two types of interaction. Locomotion, how you move around a space, and manipulation, what you can do within the space. And the most important finding we've found is that being consistent in those mechanics is vital. What the mechanic is, whether you pull the trigger to do something or you press the A button to do something, is less important than the consistency of the mechanic. Because if the consistency is broken, all of a sudden the user doesn't know what to do. Their orientation gets broken. Then we come to passive content, where basically there's 4 types of passive content. And passive content is generally the didactic stuff, right? It's the stuff that you listen to, you read, you watch. It's the stuff that you're not necessarily actively interacting with. There's text, there's audio, video, and character. Now, text in VR is a challenge, right? First off, because people don't like to read. And secondly, because reading in VR with the visual constraints of the VR headsets is not a very comfortable experience. Now, in museum studies, there's a technique for dealing with the display of text called the eCarve method. I think Beverly eCarve from Sweden came up with it like 50 years ago. That basically says short paragraphs, 45 letters to a line, and a whole bunch of other sort of guidance about what works in text. Now, that's used as guidance to shape the labels that museums put together for things to communicate whatever it is that they're trying to communicate. There's a great book on the subject, an entire book written just about exhibit labels, called Exhibit Labels, written by a person named Beverly Serrell, which is excellent. Like, if you want to geek out about words, text, and typography, I strongly recommend it. But basically, in VR, we recommend going a little bit more conservative with it. And that's mainly because of the visual constraints of the headsets. Because basically, we recommend using 1 paragraph at a time, and we recommend certain design choices about how to separate the text from the environment to make it easier for people to read. But it's basically something that you can and should be able to use. But text in VR may be less practical in many situations than audio. Because the main thing about audio is that it doesn't break immersion. Text typically does break immersion to some extent, but audio does not. Audio feels organic to a VR experience. And our recommendations here are, first off, use 3D spatialized audio. Let the audio feel natural in the space that you're working in. And we also recommend, with audio, providing a control, a playback control mechanic, so that particularly if you're communicating didactic content in your educational experience, let people rewind. Oh, I missed that. I need to hear that again. Also, some people don't like audio. I, for example, can't stand audio. Personally, my approach to learning, it doesn't work for me. I would much prefer text. But therefore, we recommend that also educational experiences provide a way for the user to disable the audio. I don't want to hear an audio guide, I want to get text instead, right? And basically our primary recommendation here again is consistency. Pick one approach to how audio is basically triggered. When does the audio start playing? Does it start playing when I, the user, say, play this audio snippet for me? Or does it start playing when I enter a particular space, or when I push a particular button, when I interact with the environment? Pick one sort of model and maintain that consistency. And that, again, sort of helps with the orientation process. Similar principles apply to video. The main difference with video, however, is basically that video can either be realized in the environment, I'm in a room and I've got a screen, or it can be abstract. I do something, and this abstract video screen shows up that plays a video. Neither one approach or the other is better or worse, but they're a choice that as designers we can make. And we recommend making that choice consciously, pick one approach and stick with that approach. In certain situations with the environment, with the realized approach, you may go down the route of a theater, right? Something like the VR Netflix experience, right? In some contexts, for some content, that may be a wise approach. Not necessarily for others, right? If I want a video of a demonstration of how to use a particular tool, I might not necessarily want to sit in a giant theater to see a 5-second clip of how to use a pneumatic hammer. Then the final example of passive content is a character guide. This is the tour guide. My favorite example of a tour guide is JobBot from Job Simulator. Little robot guy who tells me what to do, how to do it, and where to go, and sort of guides me through the experience. As a didactic tool, it's basically the equivalent of a docent, a tour guide, a teacher, who sort of walks me through the process and walks me through the experience. In practice, there are limited opportunities for playback control here. But done well and integrated into the environment, it can be incredibly immersive and incredibly compelling. And a lot of fun. And so that's basically sort of the whole sort of experience design component of it. Like I said, lighting and social issues, whole other complicated thing. But basically, the bottom line, if there's one thing that we sort of found as being sort of the guiding light for educational VR design, is this visitor's Bill of Rights. If there's one thing that you guys sort of take away from this evening, if you go for these aspirations, if you target these expectations, you'll be doing just fine. You know, it's one of those things where there may be many ways to do that. I'm often reminded of a poem by Rudyard Kipling that goes, there are 69 ways to tell a tribal lay, and every single one of them is right. And that's very true in this case, especially because we're just building best practices in VR today. I have no idea what interesting patterns and techniques and design options we haven't thought of yet. I'm sure that there's a ton out there. And so we find that a lot of inspiration in museum design that sort of has kind of guided this, right? There's a whole bunch of further reading. Like I said, 150 years of extensive research. These are just simply some of my favorite books on the subject. I'm going to be making a video of this available probably over the weekend, and I'll share that link on the meetup group so that you guys don't have to worry about sort of, scribbling down titles and stuff like that.
And do you have this on SlideShare?
I do not yet have it on SlideShare, but I can put it up on SlideShare.
Because we could probably just put a link to both.
Yep. And so basically,
A lot of meat.
that's pretty much it. Yeah, like I said, this is a lot of dense stuff. Like, there's a lot of information here. Other questions?
Yeah, how much are you doing this? I mean, obviously you're doing it enough that
We're
pretty slick how you're talking about it. I don't mean that way. My point is, you didn't throw this together for now. This is something
we've been thinking about quite a lot, basically.
Yeah.
So I mean, we're basically doing quite a lot of this stuff, and a lot of this thinking is sort of shaped by much of the educational process we're doing working with museums. So in our business, right, we're building an ecosystem to help museums and VR developers build content quickly and robustly for museum experiences. Long term, we don't want to be in the business of actually designing VR experiences. But in practice, what we're doing right now is we're doing that for the museums that we're working with in many cases because they don't have their own VR devs and they need somebody to do the work. And so this is sort of kind of the learning that has grown out of the many discussions that we've been having with museums, with museum educators and exhibit designers and visitor services teams about sort of what is the best way to design museum experiences in a VR context. It's also something that basically, I am by nature a very analytical person.
Everyone guessed.
Yeah, I know, right? And so when we first sort of started looking into this business, I wanted to learn as much as I possibly could about basically what is the science of museums. And I started looking into it and I realized, oh my God, there's a huge amount of overlap here with things that might work well within VR. And so this sort of has kind of shaped a lot of our thinking about the process. I also come from a background in media and market research. I spent, at this point, about 18 years in the media research business, which means I'm a huge believer in user research, user studies, verifying what works and what doesn't work, again, being an analytical person. So when we experiment with stuff and when we try stuff out, we usually like to collect data to see what is working and what is not working. And this is sort of the type of stuff that I'm actually really, really happy for the opportunity to put this presentation together, because this is the type of conversations that I've been having with my designers about this stuff without actually having a presentation to sort of, tie it all together. So that's one of the reasons why I'm recording all of this stuff as well, because this way I'll be able to give it to my designers to work with as well, because that makes things a little bit easy. But like I said, this is just sort of the theoretical framework of how we look at things, right? It's just sort of a way of talking about the things people are doing within VR.
So in terms of your audience for museum goers, is your audience specifically people who are currently at the museum and want to interact further, or is it people sitting at home who can't get to the museum?
Combination. We actually are targeting 3 specific audiences or 3 specific use cases. Also, we haven't released yet. We're targeting release for Q1.
Which museums are you working with?
We're under NDA with right now we're working with 5 museums at this point. But basically we're targeting release for Q1 of next year. But basically we're targeting 3 audiences. One audience is at-home users. People who are at home, maybe they're in Alabama, they can't visit a museum here in New York. VR gives them the opportunity to experience that content. That's one audience. Second audience is in-school usage. Now, school penetration of VR headsets is extremely low right now, but we expect that to change. And so what we are targeting with this is to be able to facilitate school visits, a school in Alabama. Why don't they send their 5th grade class to visit, the Louvre? And then the third sort of audience is the in-museum exhibit, which raises a whole other sort of host of problems around the logistics of that. But basically, we're focusing on the content platform, right? So some of the museums who we're working with, they're saying, hey, when the content is built, why don't we use it in the museum itself? Because a lot of the museums that we're working with are utilizing or are hoping to utilize VR to basically extend their floor space.
Are they building cave environments as opposed to, that's a lot of nasty headsets.
Yeah, so different museums are looking at a couple of different sort of options, right? There are some solutions like Awesome Rocket Ship, which is basically like a VR pod that is like a setup that you can basically install this giant,
Sort of like mini cave?
Yeah, sort of like a mini cave, basically.
Have you ever seen like a lot of people in a cave? I've been in one at Brown University where 3 people was okay.
I've seen VR arcades in Asia, where basically you've got, isolated rooms with VR setups, right? Like here's your one room with a VR setup, here's another room where there's a VR setup and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Some of the museums who we're talking to are thinking about doing stuff like that because it's relatively cheap and easy for them to do. We don't actually recommend that approach for most museums because it creates floor space challenges. We do recommend utilizing something like Awesome Rocket Ship, which is a unit, right? It's a space optimized single user thing that you put in a place. Then you have to deal with, traffic flow issues, right? And lines of people waiting to use the pod, but it's stuff like that.
I guess I figured that VR in a museum would just be more like a mobile app thing where you can look at something through your phone and it'll tell you more information. I don't know if that counts as VR.
It's sort of more an AR thing, but a lot of museums are actually doing that kind of stuff. We aren't within our platform. Like we're much more focused on sort of the big picture immersion stuff for the time being. But a lot of the museums that we're talking to are incredibly interested in AR and in things that can be done with that.
Well, I can certainly see something like for an art museum. I work in the art industry and I know that a lot of artists and things like that would be extremely interested in having their artwork be able to be experienced in like a closer way, be able to feel and touch the artwork when you're not allowed to.
Absolutely.
That would definitely be a good aspect of it.
Yeah, absolutely. We are actually very big believers in the power of AR for museums. What I think in practice is that the technology for AR isn't quite ready for commercial application. Like you can hold up your phone and get like the Pokemon Go sort of additional content, and that can be incredibly valuable. We think that the relative value of that is going to decrease very rapidly. Because what we expect to happen is over the course of the next 2 years or 3 years, you're going to see consumer-ready AR headsets, like the Microsoft HoloLens or Magic Leap, maybe, and stuff like that.
iPhone 10.
Yeah,
iPhone 8s.
exactly. And so when that technology is consumer ready, AR is going to fundamentally change the nature of the in-museum experience. And so that's our expectation. We're not targeting, in the work that we're doing, the current mobile phone AR type of thing, because we're basically making a more long-term bet on essentially glasses. That if you come to a museum, you buy your admission ticket, you get the glasses, and then that provides an additional experience. But we expect that to happen 2-3 years from now. Not quite yet. Although there's very interesting work being done with mobile phone AR within museums. The Civil War Trust has this amazing set of mobile apps where you go to a battlefield and you move them around and basically you see what the battlefield looked like, the Battle of Antietam or whatever it is. Right? Very, very cool stuff. Yep.
I think piggybacking off of what you just said, I was in Italy recently and some of the museums offered the Samsung gear, and you can look at these ancient artifacts that will then turn into what it used to look like back in the day.
Yep.
So I guess my question is that how does VR play into a person's experience when they go to the museum?
So it's the type of thing which can be incredibly additive, because what VR does within a museum, if there's a VR headset or a mobile phone within the museum that can do VR, it gives the museum the opportunity to do things that are not practical or not cost effective or not even possible in the constraints of a museum. So there are the examples of those museums in Italy. The British Museum has done a whole bunch of experiments with putting people in a Roman British village and stuff like that, where those experiences produce an incredibly positive response. Because they're things that the museum can't realistically and feasibly do with the actual artifacts themselves in the space that they've got. And so that's something that museums are very, very interested in doing. We're targeting high-end headsets, so we're not doing work on the Gear VR or on Google Daydream or Google Cardboard, mainly because we expect that over the course of the next 2 or 3 years, mobile VR is going to, like 2 years from now, mobile graphic processing units will be strong enough to do the kind of graphic fidelity that high-end headsets do today. So because we're targeting basically AAA content out, 12 months out, 18 months out, we're sort of aiming for that point. So we think that mobile VR is at an early stage right now for museums, but it is nevertheless incredibly valuable. And we think that it's only going to increase in value for museums as the graphic fidelity of mobile VR improves. I think that it's a hugely powerful thing because you can do things with it that you can't actually do in a museum. I would love to swing around and a 14th century sword, right? That would be awesome. I'm not necessarily going to be able to actually do that with an actual 14th century sword.
Yeah, could you say more about, because I don't remember hearing that much about interaction, what you found to be particularly effective?
In terms of effective in terms of what again? I'm sorry.
Well, just learning. I don't know if finding or in terms of sort of intuitive.
What we're basically finding is that the construction of the learning for interaction, right? It's a combination of how you structure the environment and the content together. They are one and the same. Environment is itself part of the educational content that you're providing. And gamification is one of the principal tools that works well in VR, and exploration is one of the principal tools that works well within VR. Because basically people like to poke things, basically. So the British Museum, as I mentioned, they did this really neat thing where all people could do within this VR experience was walk around a Roman village and pick up virtual Roman artifacts, look at them and interact with them, and that was it. That was it. There wasn't didactic content, there wasn't labels, there wasn't explanation. They could pick up a cup, pick up a pot, stuff like that. And that experience resonated very, very well with the audience because basically it gave them the opportunity to explore the environment.
Constructively.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sure, but, how valuable, sorry, just
Mhm,
to
yeah,
be
yeah.
devil's advocate,
Yeah,
how
yeah.
much, if people aren't actually particularly reflective, I mean,
Yeah,
I sort of, the problem is that I think too much still is being done where people just get a chance to sort of look at or be in.
Yeah.
And, it's sort of like, well, I don't want to insult pigs, but pigs in mud, you know what I mean? It's, ideally, I mean, experiences are people
But
can-
reflection is necessary.
Yeah, a reflection and sort of something beyond. I mean, the notion implicitly should be, right, that we're changed by it.
Yep.
And we, seeing myself in a Roman village doesn't necessarily mean I actually know a meaningful amount more about it. So that's why I wondered
So
whether
here's-
you're constructing any kinds of, and in terms of even what you talk about as gamification, whether you're finding any certain kinds of interactions or certain sorts of forms of play being particularly useful.
Yes, so there's a couple of things. So in terms of reflection, right, this is part of the thing that I view building the space for reflection into the experience as basically being part of the content structure of the experience. The mechanism to do that, the process of doing that is going to be very different depending upon the content, right? So a very good example of something that we've seen produce very good reflective results is things from the Google, is it the Google Heritage Project, which is basically photogrammetry of sites around the world that basically are in danger of being destroyed. Heritage sites from places like Syria and Iraq and places like that, where essentially these things might well go away, or they've already gone away in many cases. And those experiences provide or generate significant degrees of reflection in the user audience. The Holocaust Museum has also done a whole bunch of very interesting stuff that also is sort of oriented around and generating that sense of reflection. And that's basically a function of, we find, usually being a combination of the content, how the content is framed, the atmosphere of the overall environment, the emotional tone of the overall experience, and finally, the framing of the experience. Right? The Google Heritage Project, it's clearly framed. These are places that are in danger of going away or have already gone away. And that framing already sort of establishes or the preliminary reflective mode.
And do you find too that, because also there are a lot of critiques, because a lot of, people talking about VR and as sort of empathy engines, and then other people having critiques about empathy, even as a basic framework, saying that empathy, in terms of actually creating change, and is not half as good as compassion, which is this notion that one is just about how it makes a person feel,
Right.
which is not which has nothing to do, which essentially, if that's the only metric, people essentially feel and then,
Then the feeling goes away.
The feeling goes away and they're not changed, the world isn't changed, versus compassion. And I don't know whether sort of you see much happening in terms of actually trying to get people from experience of simply feeling to doing.
We basically see that as being right now in very early stages of that. So there's a number of VR projects that we've seen that attempt to do things along that pathway. The New York Times did a very interesting, largely 360 video-based program on refugees, which they distributed out to all New York Times subscribers via Google Cardboard.
UNVR.
Yeah, Human VR, exactly.
Project Empathy.
Yeah. And there's interesting stuff being done with that. We think right now that it's early days to assess and judge what techniques work well for that and what the actual response to that is. And partially that's because the VR audience right now is relatively small, right? There's about 2.2 million headsets for high-end VR that have been distributed out there. It's expensive group to research. Which basically means that there's relatively little hard data on what the actual change has been that VR experiences have done. At the same time, it's very early days in terms of the actual VR experiences that have been made for museums, right? There's a handful of them out there, right? So it's one of those things where this is something that we are extremely interested in because we want to understand how that works, right? And put that to work. I personally believe that there's a lot that can be done with that. The same way that VR can address things like people's phobia, that VR can also build compassion and empathy. But it's early days yet.
But I would also add that there's two questions. One is a technique question, and things like what you just covered. Another one is just creative. I mean,
Yeah.
How many photos of Vietnam were there? But there were few that demonstrably changed the way people think. How many photos of things going on in China were there? There were few that demonstrate. So I think there's two questions. You see what I'm saying? Is that the creative decisions that someone makes that aren't really codifiable. It's just someone captured the right moment the right way. So I think that there's two pieces to it.
That's an excellent point. Yeah, I would agree with that 110%.
Well, except, yeah, I guess I don't agree though that Vietnam, I mean, there was a huge battle about Vietnam.
I'm not suggesting that. My point is that from a photography standpoint, there are a number of iconic images that really made a difference.
That shaped the debate, basically, or that influenced the direction
And
of the
there
debate.
were lots of photos, but some photos are more powerful than others. My general point, not to get into the specifics of Vietnam, I'm sure at the time, is that there are two pieces. One is what you can codify as kind of rules or principles, but some of it's just a creative act. So someone does a really good job, and another person follows the same rules that doesn't, or the same person.
No, sure,
same
artistry.
Yeah, artistry.
That's-
Yeah. I mean, to be clear, VR is an art form. Like, yes, we're trying to codify certain sort of principles or guidelines here that generally hold true, but it is totally an art form. These same principles can be done beautifully. They can be applied beautifully in a moving and compassionate and emotionally evocative way, or they can be applied mechanistically and badly executed that does nothing, right? It's a craft and an art form, and we're only at the very beginning of figuring out how to actually utilize it as both a craft and an art form.
How receptive are schools to VR and in terms of like the cost, efficiency, and what they would get out of it?
So this is a very interesting thing that we're really interested in because schools are, for us, a very, very big audience, hopefully. Schools themselves, we find, tend to be very hesitant at this stage about VR hardware for two reasons. Bureaucracy and sort of the administrative process of acquiring the hardware, and more importantly, supporting the hardware once it has been acquired. Schools tend to be underfunded, understaffed. They worry about buying a brand new computer, let alone buying a really fancy computer plus a headset. So we sort of look at school penetration of VR as kind of falling into several segments. The first segment is schools that have very strong STEM programs, particularly schools that already have strong coding curriculums. The type of schools that will have Unity installed on their school computers for kids to be building games and learning how to code in C#. Those are schools that are more likely to be the early adopters of VR headsets. Now, they've still got the administrative challenge of purchasing and installing and supporting those VR headsets and integrating them into the curriculum. But what we're finding is that usually those schools that have those coding curriculums will have one or two very passionate educators who want to bring VR into the school because they want to be able to teach with it. We expect, we're sort of betting, that VR penetration into school environments is going to follow a pattern similar to that of smart boards 10 years ago, where it's going to be slow in terms of building that penetration, but as the costs of the hardware decrease, it's going to increase in that penetration. We're not expecting all the schools in the country to have VR in the next 5 years. If we get 5% penetration in the next 5 years, I'm going to be very happy. It's going to be slow running. Universities, we find, tend to have somewhat better penetration, but there's a problem of scale, in the sense that a lot of universities might have a headset or 2 headsets, and several thousand students want to use them. And that's a challenge that a lot of universities are running into. And a lot of universities are more aggressively figuring out how to deal with that problem than high schools and elementary schools. Because universities tend to also have that coding curriculum where they want to be teaching students how to use VR. We actually have an asset that we published called the VR simulator that is right now being used by like about 20 or so universities around the world to educate people about VR development, basically. When you don't have a VR headset that emulates a headset and stuff like that. And universities are really interested in teaching development for VR. And that's driving headset purchases for universities.
Sorry, I don't mean to.
Yeah, no, go for it.
Can you talk at all about your sort of testing methodologies? I don't know
Sure.
if you're using A/B test, yeah, what your sort of methods are.
Sure. So basically, we utilize a variety of methods. So we both utilize qualitative and quantitative methods. We utilize qualitative, that is basically typically in-depth interviews, and structured pre- and post-interviews. We utilize A/B testing on a quantitative basis for the stuff that we're doing. So we do A/B tests. We also do general experience U&A questions. So usage and attitudes, usage and response, perception response, and things like that. A lot of what we do is veers towards the direction of qualitative research, simply because we're dealing with relatively small sample sizes. We're not testing this on a 2,000 person sample to get very, very good sample stability on this.
Do you know if I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, any kind of, but it sounds a lot of like conscious stuff, any stuff to try to get unconscious responses,
well,
or
so
physiological ones?
we haven't done any neurophysiological stuff. We would love to, but basically we just haven't applied the budget to do that. We think it's a really fascinating area of research. I would really love to get into some of the neuroscience stuff, but we haven't done any of that yet. In terms of the unconscious stuff, we basically try to get at that through the focus group and in-depth interview structure that we do, to basically gauge emotional response, emotional association, and stuff like that.
And how about cognitive change? Are you doing anything that actually measures what people...
In terms of learning outcome?
Yeah, learning outcomes both in terms of sort of cognitive skills and
Yes.
conceptual knowledge versus practical?
Yes, so some of the testing that we've done has basically been focusing on 2 things. One is information retention, and basically sort of the degradation of information retention over time post the experience. And then the other research that we've done is basically looking at conceptual comfort and familiarity. And what we're basically finding there is that essentially the VR results for both information retention and conceptual comfort and familiarity are most shaped by, well, they're most strongly predicted by speed of orientation. And secondly, they are highly tied to the content. So we've seen certain content that is retained better than other content, even if they're both being presented in similar fashions. And we don't know why that is yet. We're still researching that. That may be an execution issue.
Complication of the subject matter, or familiarity, or
We don't have we don't have a large enough sample size to be able to sort of definitively state it's this or it's that. Coming from a media research background, I would really love to be able to research that and to know the answer to those questions. But we just haven't had the sample sizes to be able to dive into that and get meaningful responses, basically.
Chris, thank you.
Thank you guys very much.